You're given 2 life sentences for 2 murders you know you didn't commit. You're sent to the worst prison in the country, one of the worst. What do? Well, number 1, you never give up hope. And number 2, you escape. Hey everyone, welcome to another sit down with Michael Franzese. Hope everybody is doing well, and today is another Mob Movie Monday, a favorite of all of you, and it's a favorite of mine too. So this week we have a very special one, Shawshank Redemption, and brilliant movie. I'm sure many of you have seen it already. If you haven't, you got to watch it. It's terrific. You're going to really enjoy it. You know, there's so many messages in this film. Similar to the messages we had in last week's film, Carlito's Way, which I got so many great comments, so many people related to some of the things, you know, my perception of certain scenes in the film, certain things that Carlito had done wrong when he was trying to turn his life around. And you appreciated the comments, and I appreciate that. I love the feedback that I get from all of you, so it was great. And if you haven't seen Carlito's Way, go back to last week's Mob Movie Monday, watch it. I think we did a nice job in kind of laying out the messages in that film. It was a brilliant film. So today, very special. Before we get into that, again, let me thank you all. You know, all of you who are subscribing, we really appreciate it. We're over 400,000 now and climbing every day. And that's thanks to all of you, to the loyalty that you've shown and the interest you've shown in the content. I know you have a lot of choices on YouTube, so I thank you very much. Again, big giveaway when we hit 500,000. So I'm hoping we get there, and with your help, we will. Big giveaway like we did last time. You're going to love it. So let's get into the movie. Originally, the film wasn't received that well. A couple of reasons for that. I think it had strict competition in Pulp Fiction and Forrest Gump, 2 great movies that came out that same year. I think the name Shawshank Redemption was kind of off-putting to some people. So originally it wasn't a box office success. I think it grossed maybe, $16 million at the time. But this is going back to 1994. Significant money, but nowhere near the success that they had hoped it would have. And it was based upon a Stephen King novel, a novella, I think. And but it was brilliant. Frank Darabont got a hold of the property. He wrote the script. And I understand he wrote it in record time, and it was brilliant. A lot of people wanted to play the role of the lead character. It went to Tim Robbins, but I understand Kevin Costner wanted it, and even Tom Cruise and a few others. So it was a great film. There's so many messages in this. It's a message about friendship. It's a message about hope. It's a message about despair. A lot of things I can relate to, having done some prison time and understanding, how difficult it is sometimes to get through it. But it was great, so hopefully you'll enjoy what my perception of the film is. We'll get into a couple of scenes, break it down that way, and then we'll take it from there. And by the way, the film did go on to be considered to be one of the greatest movies ever made. So it kind of picked up steam. I think it was great on video when it first came out. And it's a classic. People love it, and rightfully so. Tim Robbins did a great job. Morgan Freeman, who's always brilliant in every movie that he's in, even when he plays God. He did a tremendous job in this. James Whitmore was in it. He did a great job. So everybody in it was great. And again, the film became a classic and loved by many. So what's the film about? It's a story about a banker, Tim Robbins, Andy Dufresne, who allegedly killed his wife and his wife's lover. She was cheating on him, and he followed both her and her lover to a place where they were having an affair. And that scene, it opens up like that, and the scene is showing Andy with a gun, and he's ready to go in and kill, both of them. But you don't really see that he does that, and he claims his innocence, maintains his innocence throughout the film, and I believe that that's the message. He was innocent. He was framed. It looked bad, obviously, but throughout the whole court proceeding, it turns out that he gets convicted, and he gets 2 life sentences back to back for killing each one of them. So after that opening scene, when we see Andy get convicted and sentenced to 2 life sentences, 1 for each murder, the next scene, we see him going into the prison. He gets off the bus, and they go into Shawshank. And it's a great scene. All the prisoners are lined up and they first meet the warden and the correctional officer. The warden makes a speech and he addresses all of the inmates in a way. He tells them that he's a God-fearing guy. There'll be no cussing or using the Lord's name in vain. You know right off the bat, this is a bad guy, psycho in my opinion. He tells him, he says, in here, you can put your trust in God, but your ass belongs to me. And that's a quote. Then he runs it down just the way it's going to be. And one of the inmates, one of the prisoners asks about food, when are we going to eat? And the correctional officer immediately goes over to him, big guy, and rebukes him for asking that question. And then he hits him, so you know right off the bat, this is going to be a problem place. He hits him, and the warden finishes his address, and that's the end of that. And you can see Andy there. He's scared stiff. He's a banker. Never went through anything like this before. And let me tell you, prison can be pretty frightening, for certain people when you first walk in. When I went into prison, it wasn't frightening, really, because I had visited my dad for many, many years. I knew exactly what to expect when I got there. I knew one day I would be doing time, so it wasn't so much frightening to me, but certainly isn't a great feeling when you first get behind those bars, I can tell you that. So that was a great scene. All right, so Andy now gets into prison. He starts to meet some of the other inmates, and he meets up with the Morgan Freeman character, who is Ellis Red Redding. Morgan Freeman has done, 20 years in prison, so he's kind of established in there. And he takes a liking to Andy. Andy takes a liking to him, and this friendship kind of develops. And it's a beautiful friendship that develops throughout the whole film. And they really care for each other. And one of the highlights of the film for me is that friendship. And we really start to see Andy's character. He really is a good guy, cares about the other inmates, cares about Red, and there's no way that he's going to spend the rest of this time in prison. As far as he's concerned, he was innocent. He's not giving up hope. He's going to do what he needs to do in there. And I understand that. When you're inside, really, and you have a life outside, like with me, I had a wife, I had children, I had a life outside, all you think about is getting out. And Andy, he kept that spirit, he kept that drive, he kept that hope the entire way through. That's all he was thinking about, is how he's going to get out of these 2 life sentences and how one day he's going to get on the outside. Another great scene, I thought, was when all the inmates are on the rooftop and the prison guard that we originally saw is on there, and he's talking to some of the other guards, and the prisoners are tarring the roof. They're cleaning the roof. Very, very hot day. And this prison guard starts to complain to the other guards about money that he's getting and how the government is going to tax them, and he's a real arrogant, miserable type of guy. And he's complaining to all of his associates there, the other guards, about how he's making this money, but the government is going to tax him. At the end of the day, it's not going to be anything left over. They're going to take like 30 grand from him out of, whatever the total amount was. And Andy's listening to all this, because remember, he was a banker. He's a banker, and he's always thinking, how can he help himself in some way to eventually get out of this mess that he's in? So he says something to the prison guard that upsets him, really upsets him. The prison guard is going to throw him off the roof. Very upset with him, going to throw him off the roof. And as he's throwing him off the roof, or getting near the end of the roof, Andy says, wait a minute, I can show you how you can keep that 30 grand and give it to your wife. And so now the guard is listening to him a little bit. And what do you mean by that? And Andy explains himself. And, the guard says, what do you want for all of this? And Andy says, I don't want anything for myself, but I want something for my fellow inmates, something to drink, maybe a beer, something we can have, because it was hot up there. He was only thinking about his friends. He wasn't thinking about himself. So anyway, this scene starts him off on something. The guard says, okay. Pretty soon word gets to the warden that Andy is brilliant in this regard, and he can save money. Well, what does the warden do? The warden wants to start to launder his own money. And Andy basically becomes the accountant for the warden and starts doing illicit things with him. This warden was a bad guy. And let me tell you, throughout my prison years, and I spent about 8 years there, and obviously my dad spent 40, so I was in touch with a lot of prison guards. And let me tell you, they're not all like this guy. As a matter of fact, most of them were not. As far as the guard was concerned, this was a mean son of a gun, just an arrogant, mean, bullying type, didn't like inmates. He was a bad guy. And you get some of them. I was in the federal system, so they kind of behave themselves. A lot of them are just arrogant. They don't like you. They're taught when they're training that inmates are bad guys, don't trust them, stay away from them. So they come in with that mentality. Then your own life takes over, your own personality. So some of the guards that I met, many of them were pretty decent guys. They really were. I didn't have a lot of trouble with them, maybe one or two, oh, you're a mafia guy. And so they wanted to show their superiority, that they had power over you. I get it. You didn't really take it to heart. You kind of understood that's who they were. But a lot of them were pretty good. I mean, really. If you didn't bother them, they didn't bother you. They did their job, and that was that. So you didn't see much of that. As far as the wardens are concerned, I never seen anybody like this guy. Some wardens didn't care about you. They didn't want to know you. They didn't want to talk to you. Others were not too bad. And again, I had a few. When I was on diesel therapy, they put me in a few different prisons in the system. So I came up with different wardens, and they always kind of addressed me because I was a central monitoring inmate, and they wanted to let me know that they were in charge of the prison. But basically, you don't have guards as arrogant and as mean as this guy was. But anyway, word gets to the warden. Andy now has got himself in a position where he's tight with the warden, even though the warden makes him understand, you know what I mean? I'll crush you, I'll break you, you do anything wrong, so on and so forth. He lets him always know who's in power and who's in control. But Andy's starting to feel his way and starting to scheme a little bit and starting to see how he can use this position to maybe eventually help him get out of jail. Another character I guess I can relate to, not for myself, but for other inmates that I knew in there during my time, inmates that had done a lot of time, 25, 30, 40 years, that became so institutionalized, they were kind of fearful of ever getting on the outside. When you do that much time, if you're married, normally your wife is not going to be there when you get out, and your family ties are not as good. After a while, the visits stop, so you become very institutionalized in such a way that you're almost scared of going out on the street. And I saw a couple of guys that were really like this. Well, the James Whitmore character was, I think his name was Brooks in the film, he was one of those guys. He finally gets released from prison. He didn't really want to go. He didn't know what to do. He was a stranger to the outside. It's very, very sad. And he's out, he's on parole. This voiceover of him talking how he's trying to adjust and how he can't really adjust to the outside. The bottom line is, in a terrible scene, he's so deflated and just so depressed and just so unsteady of being in the outside world that he eventually hangs himself. He commits suicide. Terrible thing. When word gets back to the inmates on the inside, Andy knows it, and Red knows it, and the other ones know it, and they're all feeling bad. And Red kind of relates to that. On his scene, he says, look, I've been down so long, over 20 years of my life, half of my life. I'm so institutionalized, I don't know what to do when I get on the outside. And it's amazing. When you get into that kind of routine where this is your life day after day after day, for many of those people, the outside world becomes extremely frightening. That's what happened with Brooks hanging himself, and that's what was happening with Red. He was so institutionalized that he was kind of fearful of getting on the outside. Yeah, another scene, the dialogue in this was so great. There's another scene that really got to me when Andy and Red are talking, and Andy is he's down, he's depressed, and he just doesn't want to give up, man. He wants to get out. And he's talking about hope, having hope. And Red is so down on that, so hopeless, I would say, because of all the time, and all the time he's been turned down for parole. There's a guy that's been in prison over 20 years. At that point in time, if you're not rehabilitated, you'll never be rehabilitated. And he got turned down from the parole board a couple of times, so he has no hope. Andy said hope was what I live on, and a really telling line was when Morgan Freeman looks at him and he says, let me tell you something, my friend. Hope is a dangerous thing. Hope can drive a man insane. It's got no use on the inside. You better get used to that idea. In other words, what he's telling Andy is, don't have hope in here. You got 2 life sentences. You're not going anywhere. Hope is going to drive you crazy. Hope has no use on the inside when you're facing life in prison. That's a devastating thing to say, but Andy wasn't ready to accept that. But it showed you where Red's mentality was. And I can relate to that. The second time when I violated my parole and they threw me in the hole, and the government was very upset with me, and they told me, you're never going to see the street again. We're bringing new charges against you. You're going to spend the rest of your life in prison. My wife had a breakdown, and they threw me in the hole, and I knew that's where I had to stay for quite some time. Almost 3 years is what I spent in there. If it wasn't for hope, man, I don't know how I would have endured that. I don't know how I would have gotten through it. Going back to what I said about some of the guards, for me, it was a prison guard that was so vital in giving me hope. And what I mean by that, the first night I came in, I've told this before, that guard handed me a Bible. He slipped it through the slot on the door. And once I picked that Bible up and started to develop my faith in God and my faith in Christ, that's when my hope elevated to the point where I said, you know what? I'm not destined to spend the rest of my life in here. I'm going to fight back and I'm going to have faith and trust in God. And as it turned out, the life sentence they were going to give me, the new charges they were going to bring against me, wouldn't stick. They couldn't do it. They couldn't indict me again, and I ended up only doing 4 years on the parole violations. But hope is what kept me going. People, when you lose hope, you got nothing else in life. Hope is what keeps you going, so don't ever let anybody tell you that life is so hopeless that there's nothing for you to look forward to, because when you give up, you got nothing. But that was a very telling scene and kind of got to me. Now, Andy seems to have, as the movie develops, you'll see how it goes, and I'm not going to go step by step, but Andy seems to have figured out a way to get himself out of prison, and obviously he has to escape, how to set up the warden, how to set up the guard. It's brilliant the way he does it. The warden and the guard fell right into his trap because Andy was brilliant. And it took him a long time. We're talking about years and years and years. He did a lot of time, but he never gave up hope, and he just kept scheming, and he was so methodical in what he did. Maybe scheming is the wrong word, just planning, I should say, because he was innocent, and he was doing time for a crime he didn't commit. But there's another very telling scene. He's with Red, and they're talking. And Red is always trying to convince him, Andy, give it up, man. Be realistic. You got 2 life sentences. You're not going to escape. You're not going to get out. This is it for the rest of your life. Andy says something to him that I think is probably the most popular, famous line in this movie for sure, and maybe in a lot of movies. He says to him, I guess it comes back to a simple choice, really, and that is you get busy living or you get busy dying. Think about that. Andy wasn't going to give it up. He wasn't ready to die in there. He said it's a simple choice. You either get busy living and trying to get to that point, or you get busy dying. And Andy was going to get busy living. And Red still wasn't convinced. He sat there being the old timer that he was, and he just went along because he loved Andy. And that was it. And then it progresses, and we see Andy make his escape. He does get out. The warden gets busted for money laundering. The guard, the same thing. He set it up beautifully. He gets out. He's on the outside. He takes a trip to Mexico, wherever the heck he is, and the dream that he had comes true. Now, here's another thing. Red gets out on parole. And it's funny, you know, this scene with the parole board was great because every time Red had gone into the parole board before, he was always very sympathetic character, and, you know, I'm reformed and I'm doing my best and so on and so forth, and he was always trying to get on the good side of the parole board. Well, this time he went in, he didn't care. He said, I don't care about you people. Who are you to tell me what my life is all about? And he kind of gives it to them really hard, right? He doesn't even care because he figures he doesn't have a shot at parole. Well, what happens? He makes parole. So now he's on the outside, and he's trying to make it out there too. And it's tough. But he gets a message from Andy, and Andy is kind of giving him some steps because he's got to be careful. Andy doesn't want to get caught. He's now a fugitive. He escaped from prison. But he gives Red these steps to kind of lead him to Andy. But what does Red have to do? He has to violate his parole and follow Andy, trust him. So he says, for the second time in my life, I'm committing a crime. He violates his parole, and he starts to follow the instruction that Andy had left him. Great scene where he gets to a place where Andy had buried a box, and in that box it's a letter to Red telling him where to go, what to do, and there's money for him to get there. So Red goes for it, and at the end of the movie we see Andy, he's fixing a boat. He had talked to Red about this while he was in prison. He's on the beach, and you see Red kind of walking towards him, and the 2 friends are going to meet up, and it's such a warm, beautiful scene. Really got to me, man. It was really great. So that's the end of the movie, and people, again, the messages, what are they? Number 1, never give up. Once you give up, you're done. Number 2, friendship means everything, really means everything, and the friendship that these 2 men developed throughout the film was just beautiful. So hope is a beautiful thing. Don't ever give up on it. Friendship, when you have a true friend, man, it's worth all the money in the world. It really is. So that's it. Great film, Shawshank Redemption. Hope you enjoyed the review. We're coming back with another next Monday for sure. MichaelFranzese.com. Our community is building, again, over 12,000, approaching 13,000 people now that just keep uplifting each other. A lot of great content that we're putting in there, helpful, useful to all of you. My inner circle, doing a couple of Zoom calls a month, a lot of great stuff, good content going in there. I do a Q&A with them. If you want to get involved, great. And now we have even another platform. It's the Concierge platform. That's real one-on-one with me and my team. We'll get into that a little bit more. So, okay, thank you again. Keep subscribing. We really appreciate it. You get alerts whenever a new video is coming up. So that's it for today. How do I leave you? Always the same way, from my heart. Be safe, be healthy. God bless all of you, and I will see you next time.